The document on the table gave Sadie Walker exactly 1 hour to pay $340 or lose every acre of land her husband had died trying to hold together. And as she stood in the doorway of her farmhouse watching the dust rise on the horizon, she knew with a cold and sinking certainty that not a single decent man in Caldwell, Kansas, was coming to help her. It was the summer of 1882, and the heat that rolled across the southern Kansas plains was the kind that made the air shimmer and the cattle press together in whatever shade the scrub brush could offer. Sadie had been a widow for 11 months. Her husband, Thomas Walker, had taken a fever in September of the previous year and had not survived the week. He had left her with 400 acres of good grazing land, a modest 2-room farmhouse with a stone chimney, a well that ran clean, a herd of 32 longhorns, and a debt to the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell that she had not known existed until a man in a gray suit arrived at her door 6 weeks after the burial. The debt was Thomas's doing, though she had long since made her peace with the fact that Thomas had never been a particularly practical man. He had borrowed against the land to buy more cattle in the spring of 1881, convinced that the cattle market would hold and that he would turn enough profit by autumn to clear the note. He had been wrong. The market had dipped that summer, the fever had taken him before autumn arrived, and Sadie had spent the last 11 months doing everything a woman alone could do to hold that land together. She had sold 10 head of cattle in the spring at a poor price. She had taken in mending and laundry from 3 families in town. She had planted a kitchen garden that she tended before the sun came up and after it went down. She had written to her brother in St. Louis, who had written back with kind words and no money, because her brother had 4 children and a dry goods business that was barely staying above water itself. She had done everything she could think of, and it had not been enough. The debt was $340, and she had $212 in a tin box beneath the floorboard under her bed. She had been 11 months short. The man in the gray suit was named Gerald Holt, and he worked for a man named Douglas Crane, who owned the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell and also owned 3 other businesses in town, and had a reputation for acquiring land from people who could not meet their notes. Gerald Holt had come to her house that morning with a document and a pocket watch, and he had told her in a flat and entirely dispassionate voice that she had until noon to produce $340 in full or sign the land over to the bank. He had then looked at his watch, told her it was currently 11 o'clock, tipped his hat, and ridden back toward town. Sadie had stood in the doorway for a long time after Gerald Holt disappeared down the road. She had pressed her palms flat against the door frame and breathed slowly, the way she had learned to breathe when the panic tried to rise up through her chest like floodwater. She was 28 years old. She had been in this territory since she was 19, when she had come west from Missouri with Thomas, full of the particular kind of courage that comes from being young and not yet knowing what the land can take from you. She had grown that courage into something tougher and less romantic over 9 years of hard seasons, and she was not a woman who wept easily or surrendered to despair without a fight. But she was also honest enough with herself to know that she was out of options. She had gone to the bank 3 weeks ago and spoken to Douglas Crane himself. He had listened to her with his hands folded on his desk and his expression perfectly calibrated to suggest sympathy while conveying none of it. He had told her that the bank was a business and that he was sure she understood the necessity of meeting financial obligations, and he had told her that the note would come due on the 22nd of June and that he expected full payment. He had not offered an extension. He had not offered a partial arrangement. He had offered nothing except the door, which his secretary had helpfully opened for her. She had gone to the mayor of Caldwell, a man named Herbert Swain who had known Thomas and who had shaken Thomas's hand at every town social and who had eaten at her table twice. Herbert Swain had told her that he had no authority over the bank's business practices and that he was sorry for her difficulty, and that perhaps she should consider whether a smaller piece of property might suit her needs. She had not struck Herbert Swain, though the impulse had moved through her like something electrical. She had gone to the sheriff, a man named Caldwell who was a decent enough man but who had told her plainly that the bank's legal claim was solid and that there was nothing in law that compelled them to grant her more time. He had looked genuinely troubled saying it, and she had believed him, which had made it somehow worse. She had gone to every man of means she could think of in Caldwell, asking not for charity but for a loan, promising to pay it back with interest, offering the cattle as collateral. Not one of them had agreed. Some had been kind about it, some had not. All of them had said no. And now it was 11 o'clock in the morning, and she had 1 hour, and she was standing in her doorway watching the dust rise on the road that led from town, and she knew that nobody was coming. Except that as she stood there, something did come down the road. It was a single rider on a dark brown horse, moving at an unhurried pace, and even from a distance Sadie felt something shift in her chest that she could not immediately name. She knew the way that rider sat his horse before she could make out the face. She knew it because she had seen it before and had specifically tried not to think about it since. Luke Collier. She said the name in her mind with the complicated mixture of feelings it always produced in her, which included, in roughly equal parts, irritation, unease, and something else that she had spent considerable energy refusing to examine too closely. Luke Collier was 29 years old, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, and possessed of a kind of quiet that was either very calm or very dangerous depending on the day and the situation. He was originally from Texas, or so the story went. He had come to the Caldwell area about 2 years ago and had never settled anywhere permanent, never taken up regular work that anyone could account for, and never been entirely trusted by the respectable population of the town. There had been rumors, and in a territory where rumors traveled faster than the postal service, and with considerably more embellishment, the rumors about Luke Collier had been vivid. People said he had ridden with an outfit in Texas that operated on the wrong side of the law. People said he had been involved in a robbery of a Wells Fargo express car near Abilene 3 years back, though no one had ever proven it and no warrant had ever been issued for his arrest in Kansas. People said he was the kind of man you kept your daughters away from, and also your cattle, and also your good silver. Sadie had formed her own opinion of Luke Collier, which was that he was trouble in a very attractive package, and that she wanted nothing to do with him. She had first encountered him about 8 months ago in the winter, when she had gone to the feed store in Caldwell and found him there, leaning against the counter, talking with the owner in a way that suggested they were well acquainted. He had held the door for her without being asked, and had looked at her with dark eyes that were entirely too direct for comfort. She had thanked him with a nod and thought nothing more of it. The second time she had encountered him was in March, when her fence line along the north pasture had come down in a storm and 3 of her cattle had wandered. She had been out in the cold morning trying to drive them back by herself when Luke Collier had appeared on his horse, as if materializing from the gray light, and without a word of introduction or explanation, he had helped her turn the cattle and hold them while she got the fence enough repaired to keep them in. He had worked efficiently and without complaint, and when she had thanked him and offered him breakfast, he had declined with a short, unreadable smile and ridden off without telling her where he was going or why he had been on her land in the first place. The third time had been at a town social in April, where he had appeared for approximately 40 minutes, spoken to almost no one, and spent an uncomfortable amount of time standing at the edge of the room in a way that made Sadie feel, with great irritation, that she was acutely aware of exactly where he was at every moment. She had not spoken to him that evening, and he had left before supper. There had been a fourth time in May, when she had gone to the livery stable to have her horse's shoe looked at, and he had been there, and they had exchanged perhaps 6 sentences, none of which she could remember clearly now, except that his voice was low and unhurried, and that it had irritated her in the specific way that things irritate you when they get under your skin against your will. She had told herself on multiple occasions that her awareness of Luke Collier was simply the natural vigilance of a woman alone who had a reputation for trouble riding onto the edges of her life. She did not find him interesting. She did not find him admirable. She found him suspicious and unsettling, and those were very different things. She found him standing at her fence gate now, having pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted with the unhurried ease of a man who had never been in a hurry in his life, and she watched him walk up the path to her door with his hat in his hand and his expression giving away exactly nothing. "Mrs. Walker," he said. "Mr. Collier," she said, and was proud of how level her voice was. He looked at her steadily for a moment and then looked past her at the document on the table, which was visible through the open door. He looked back at her. "Word travels in Caldwell," he said. "Holt came to see you this morning." "Word travels very fast," she said. "It does." He turned his hat in his hands once the way she had noticed men did when they were trying to choose their words. "I heard the terms." She watched him. And I've got $340, he said simply, as if this were the most ordinary thing he could have said. Sadie stared at him. The morning light was bright behind him, and the air smelled of dry grass and the distant suggestion of rain that might or might not arrive by afternoon. A meadowlark called from the pasture fence, bright and completely indifferent to the conversation happening at the farmhouse door. "No," she said. He did not look surprised. "You don't want to hear the terms." "I don't want your money," she said. "I don't know where that money comes from, and I don't intend to find out, and I won't have any part of it." He was quiet for a moment, and the quiet was the particular kind that made a person want to fill it, which she refused to do. "The money comes from cattle," he said finally. "I've been working a drive out of Wichita. Legitimate work. I can show you the pay record if that matters to you." She looked at him. She had learned over years of dealing with people, particularly men who wanted something or wanted to give you something when you didn't want them to, that the truth had a particular texture to it that was different from a well-constructed lie. Luke Collier looked like he was telling the truth. This did not mean he was. "Why?" she said. "Why what? Why are you here? Why do you have $340 ready to bring to my door on this particular morning? Why would you do that?" He held her gaze. "Because you're about to lose your land and nobody in this town who should have helped you has done it." "That's not an answer to my question." "No," he agreed. "It's not." The silence stretched between them, taut as a fence wire. "I'm not offering charity," he said. "I'm offering a loan, same as you asked from half the men in Caldwell who said no. I'm not asking you to like me or to trust me past what I can earn. I'm asking you to let me keep the bank from taking what's yours." Sadie looked at the road. There was nothing coming down it. There was nothing coming, and there would be nothing coming, and she had 53 minutes left and the document on the table and $212 in the tin box under her bed. "What are your terms?" she said, and each word felt like it cost her something. "You pay me back when you can," he said. "No interest." "No deadline." She looked at him sharply. "That's not a business arrangement, that's something else." "Call it whatever you like," he said. "Those are my terms." "I won't accept money with no terms," she said. "I won't be beholden to anyone with nothing in writing and nothing agreed." He considered this. "All right, you pay me back at the going note rate, whatever the bank charges. 5 years. If you can't manage it in 5 years, we renegotiate." She looked at him for a long moment. The meadowlark called again. The dust on the road did not stir. "Come inside," she said. "We're going to write that down." He followed her inside, and she was acutely aware of how the two-room house seemed to change its proportions with him in it. She got paper from the small desk in the corner and a pen and the ink bottle, and she wrote the terms herself, carefully, in the clear hand that Sister Agnes at the school in Missouri had drilled into her as a girl. She wrote the amount, the rate, the schedule of repayment, and she wrote that the loan was secured against nothing except her word and her intention to repay, because she would not put the land up as collateral against a man she did not fully trust when the land was the entire reason she was doing this. She slid the paper across the table to him. He read it without expression and signed his name at the bottom. His handwriting was better than she would have expected, which somehow made her more unsettled rather than less. She signed her name beneath his and kept one copy and gave him the other. He reached into his jacket and produced the money, and she counted it there on the table with him watching, because she was not going to pretend dignity when the practical matter was what it was. It was all there, mostly paper bills, a few coins. She added it to the 212 from the tin box and put it in the envelope she had ready. "I need to get to town," she said. "I'll ride with you," he said. "That's not necessary." "Gerald Holt will be there," he said. "And Douglas Crane may or may not honor the payment without someone present who isn't going to be intimidated." She opened her mouth and closed it, because this was, frustratingly, a reasonable point. Gerald Holt was a small man who had never intimidated her personally, but Douglas Crane was a different matter, and the bank had a way of creating bureaucratic difficulties when it suited their purpose. "You ride your horse and I'll ride mine," she said. "We're not together, you're just going to town." He almost smiled. She could see the edge of it at the corner of his mouth. "That's fine," he said. They rode to Caldwell side by side, despite her stated preference, because the road was not wide enough to convincingly maintain the fiction of separate journeys, and she was not going to ride ahead of him or behind him like they were strangers playing at something. Caldwell in 1882 was a cattle town, built on the commerce of the Kishom Trail, dusty and loud, and possessed of a particular energy that came from being the last major stop before the Indian Territory to the south. The main street was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, lined with false-fronted buildings, and at 11:45 on a June morning it was busy with the ordinary business of a working town. She could feel eyes on them as they rode in together, or near together, and she set her jaw and looked straight ahead. The First Territorial Bank of Caldwell was a solid brick building on the east side of the main street, one of the few buildings in town that was not made of wood, and this solidity was clearly intentional, meant to communicate permanence and authority to people who might otherwise question whether their money was entirely safe inside it. Gerald Holt's horse was tied outside. Sadie dismounted and tied her own horse to the rail and walked in without waiting to see what Luke Collier did. Gerald Holt was inside, standing near the counter, and he looked up when she entered with an expression of professional neutrality that suggested he had been expecting her to arrive either with the money or with an appeal, and that he was prepared to handle either outcome. "Mrs. Walker," he said. "Mr. Holt," she said. She placed the envelope on the counter. $340, full payment of the note. Holt looked at the envelope, and then at her and then past her, where Luke Collier had entered quietly and taken a position near the door with his arms at his sides and his expression perfectly blank. Holt's own expression shifted in a way she found instructive. He had clearly known about Luke Collier's reputation too. "I'll need to count it and have Mr. Crane verify," Holt said. "Then count it," she said. Holt counted it. He counted it twice. He then went into the back office and was gone for 4 minutes, and Sadie stood at the counter and did not look at Luke Collier and did not look at the clock on the wall and breathed slowly and evenly the way she had learned. Douglas Crane came out of the back office. He was a tall man, wide through the shoulders, with silver hair and the groomed appearance of a man who spent money on his grooming and wanted you to know it. He looked at Sadie with the expression she had seen when she had sat in his office 3 weeks ago, the perfectly calibrated simulacrum of sympathy. "Mrs. Walker," he said. "Mr. Crane," she said. He looked at the counted money on the counter. He looked at her. He looked briefly at Luke Collier by the door. Something moved behind his eyes. "This appears to be in order," he said. "Yes," she said, "it does." "I'll have the receipt and the discharge of note prepared," he said. She waited. The discharge was prepared. She read it carefully before she signed anything, and when she was satisfied that it said what it should say and that no language had been inserted that could be interpreted to leave the bank any remaining claim, she signed her name. She took the receipt. She thanked no one, because she had nothing to thank Douglas Crane for, and she did not particularly feel like performing gratitude she did not feel. She walked out of the bank into the bright noon sunlight with the receipt in her hand and stood on the boardwalk and let out a breath that had apparently been held somewhere deep in her chest for approximately 3 weeks. Luke Collier came out behind her and stood beside her on the boardwalk. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Thank you," she said finally, and the words came out quieter than she intended, stripped of the formal distance she had been maintaining. "You're welcome," he said, and his voice was equally quiet, and he was not looking at her with any kind of triumph or expectation, which surprised her. She had expected one or the other. She looked at him. In the full noon light on the boardwalk of the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, he looked very much like what he was, which was a man who had lived hard and knew it, and had decided at some point to make peace with that knowledge. There were lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting at horizons, and there was a scar along his jaw that she had noticed before but not allowed herself to look at directly. He was not a handsome man in the way that Thomas had been handsome, open-faced, and easily readable. He was something more complicated. She looked away. "I need to get back," she said. "The cattle need moving to the south pasture before the afternoon heat." "I know," he said. She looked at him again. "You know my grazing schedule." He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I know the land around here." She studied him for a moment. "Come to supper," she said, and the words came out before she had fully decided to say them. "It's the least I can do, supper and nothing else." He was quiet for a beat. "All right," he said. She rode home alone because she needed the time to think, and there was a great deal to think about. She thought about the fact that she had just accepted a loan from a man she did not fully trust. She thought about the receipt folded in her pocket and the profound, dizzying relief of it. She thought about the way Luke Collier had stood at the bank door with his arms at his sides and his expression blank, and how Douglas Crane had looked at him with something she could only describe as wariness, and how that wariness had accomplished, in 4 minutes, what 3 weeks of her own legitimate pleading had not accomplished. She thought about the fact that she had invited him to supper. She got home and changed the cattle and worked through the afternoon with the focused efficiency that hard years had built into her. And by the time the sun began to drop toward the western plain, she had chicken in the pan and biscuits in the oven, and the kitchen filled with the smell of both. And she had also brushed her hair and pinned it neatly, which she told herself was simply because she always brushed her hair before supper and had nothing to do with the expected company. He arrived at 6 o'clock on the nose, and she marked this, because men who arrived when they said they would arrive were rarer in her experience than people admitted. He knocked at the door, which she also marked, because he could have simply come to the open window or called out, as people often did. He knocked and waited. She let him in, and he took his hat off immediately and held it at his side, and she realized she had never seen him without his hat before. His hair was dark and a little long, and he had made some effort to comb it, which she found, against her will, endearing. "Sit down," she said, and gestured at the table. He sat. She put food on the table and sat across from him, and for a moment they both simply looked at the food and neither of them spoke, and she became suddenly aware that she had not sat across from a man at this table for dinner since Thomas had died, and that this was a stranger who was not a stranger across from her in her dead husband's chair. "Say grace?" he asked. She blinked. She had not expected that. "You say it," she said. He bowed his head and said a brief and honest grace. Nothing elaborate, just thanks for the food and the day and the people who made it. And she listened to his voice saying these ordinary words and felt something shift in her chest again, that unnamed thing, and she was careful not to examine it too closely. They ate. The chicken was good and the biscuits were good, and the coffee she made afterward was strong. And between the eating and the coffee they talked, haltingly at first and then with more ease than she would have predicted. She asked him where the cattle drive had taken him, and he told her, describing the country south toward the territory with the sparse but accurate detail of a man who had actually been there and not just heard about it. She asked about the work, and he described it without embellishment, which she respected. A lot of men embellished their ranch work, making it sound more heroic than it was. He made it sound like work, which was what it was. He asked about the land. Not about her finances or her problems or her late husband, but about the land itself, what she grew, how the water ran, what the soil was like in the north pasture versus the south. She answered him and found herself talking longer than she intended, because the land was something she knew deeply and rarely had anyone to talk to who genuinely listened. He listened like someone who understood land, who had a feeling for it, and she found this disorienting because it was not what she had expected from him. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked at one point. She looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "Never. Not even today. Especially not today," she said. "Today reminded me exactly what this land is worth." He nodded slowly. "That's a good answer." "It's not an answer for your benefit," she said. "It's just the truth." "I know," he said, and he did not seem offended, just thoughtful. After the coffee, she walked him to the door, the same walk she had made with Thomas for 9 years, through the kitchen and past the fireplace and to the front door with its view of the evening sky turning colors over the flat plain. The sun was down, and the sky was doing its theatrical best, all orange and rose and the first suggestion of deep blue at the eastern edge. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and looked at the sky and then looked at her. "I'll come by on Saturday," he said, "to check the north fence. There was a section that looked soft when I was up there last week." She raised her eyebrows. "You were on my land last week." He met her eyes without flinching. "I've been keeping an eye on the property," he said. She stared at him. "Without telling me." "Without telling you," he agreed. "I should have told you. I'm sorry." She searched his face for the falseness that should have been there, a man with hidden intentions presenting himself as protective, and she did not find it. What she found instead was something simpler and more disconcerting, which was that he had been worried about her, and had acted on that worry in the only way that seemed available to him, and he was not sure how to apologize for it because he was not entirely sure it was wrong. "On Saturday," she said, "you can come to the front gate and knock, like a person." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and this time he did smile briefly, the full version of the almost smile she had been seeing all day, and it did something unfortunate to the quality of the evening air around her. She closed the door after he left and stood in her kitchen for a moment with her hands flat on the table and breathed slowly. He came on Saturday. He came to the front gate and knocked on the post, and she walked out to meet him and showed him the north fence section, and he had been right that it needed attention. He worked on it for 3 hours while she worked nearby on a different problem with the watering trough, and they worked in a companionable silence that she found simultaneously comfortable and alarming. When the fence was done, they sat on the porch, and she brought out 2 glasses of cold water from the well, and they drank them without talking and watched the afternoon heat shimmer on the grass. "Tell me something true about yourself," she said suddenly. He turned to look at her. "Something I wouldn't know from asking anyone in town," she said. "Something real." He considered this for a long moment. "I had a brother," he said, "younger, named Will. He died when he was 22. That was 6 years ago." She waited. "He made different choices than I did," Luke said. "Better ones. He was the steady one, the one who would have built something. I was the one who ran. When he died, I didn't know what to do with being the only one left, so I kept running." He paused. "I've been slowing down lately." She held the glass in both hands and looked at the shimmer on the grass. "Thomas had a brother too," she said. "Still living in Virginia somewhere. He didn't come to the funeral." "Didn't write. Thomas would have been hurt by that, I think, if he'd known." "Were you hurt by it?" "I was angry," she said. "I'm still a little angry." He nodded. "That's fair." "Now you tell me something that will make me trust you less," she said, "because I think I'm starting to trust you, and I want to know if I should." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "In Texas," he said. "In 1877, I rode with a man named Decker who ran cattle that weren't always his. I knew it, and I did it anyway because I needed the work, and I told myself I'd get out when things got better. Things got worse instead. I got out before anyone was arrested, and Decker went to prison the following year, and I've been working clean since then. But I did it." He looked at her directly. "That's the worst of it." She looked back at him. The meadowlark was in the pasture again, the same one or one that sounded like it. "All right," she said. "All right, you believe me, or all right, you're ending the conversation." "All right, I believe you," she said. "And all right, I'm making another glass of water because it's hot, and you can have one too if you want." He wanted one. He came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that. Each time there was work of some kind, a legitimate purpose, a fence or a trough or a matter with the cattle that required an extra pair of hands. But she noticed that the work was finishing faster as the weeks went on, and that more of the time was being spent on the porch or at the table with coffee, talking, and that she was spending Thursday and Friday in a state of mild anticipation that she was increasingly unable to attribute to anything besides looking forward to seeing him. By the fourth Saturday, in late July, she had stopped pretending it was primarily about the work. They were sitting on the porch in the long light of early evening, and the sky was doing something extraordinary with clouds coming in from the west, big thunderheads building purple and silver, and catching the late sun in ways that made the whole horizon look painted, and she was aware of him sitting in the chair beside her with the same acute awareness she had been trying to manage for weeks. "Luke," she said. "Sadie," he said, and the sound of her given name in his voice made something in her go very still. They were both quiet for a moment. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said honestly. "Neither do I," he said. "Not entirely." "I was married for 9 years," she said. "Thomas was a good man, not a perfect man, but a good one, and I loved him, and I'm not sure I know how to be anything other than his widow yet." "You don't have to know anything," he said. "I'm not asking you to." She looked at him. "What are you doing then?" He looked back at her, and in the strange purple-silver light of the incoming storm his eyes were very dark. "I'm sitting on your porch," he said, "and I'm hoping you'll let me keep sitting on it." She breathed out slowly. "I can do that," she said. The storm came in over the next hour, and they moved inside, and she lit the lamp and made coffee, and they sat at the table, while the rain hit the roof and the lightning lit up the windows. And they talked about everything and nothing, about the land and the town and the coming autumn and what the cattle market might do, and about the places they had each been, and the people they had known, and the way the territory changed you if you were in it long enough. At some point during the storm she had moved her chair a little closer to his without particularly deciding to, and he had not commented on it. And when the storm began to ease around 9 o'clock, she looked at the table and saw that their hands were nearly touching, just his fingers and hers on the rough wood of the table, an inch apart, which somehow felt more charged than a lot of things she had experienced. She put her hand over his just briefly and then took it back. He looked at her. "I wanted to do that," she said, "so I did." He turned his hand over, palm up, on the table. She looked at it and then put her hand in his, and his fingers closed around hers, warm and careful, and they sat like that while the last of the rain moved through. It was the most careful courtship she could have imagined, slower than she would have expected from a man like him, or from her own need for human connection after 11 months alone. But she was grateful for the slowness because it let her know each step before she took it and be sure of it. He was there every weekend through August. He started coming on Wednesdays as well, with one reason or another, a question about the cattle or a piece of equipment from town that he had picked up on her behalf, and the reasons became less elaborate and then stopped being reasons at all. He simply came and she simply let him, and the land between his horse and her front gate seemed to grow shorter with each passing week. In late August, on a Wednesday evening when the air had finally begun to lose some of its summer weight, she was on the porch when he arrived, and he dismounted and walked up, and she stood up from her chair, and he stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her with that direct, unhurried gaze. "Sadie," he said. "Yes," she said before he had asked anything. He looked at her for a moment with something in his eyes that was very like wonder, and then he put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her, gently, carefully, as if she were something he had been waiting a long time to be careful with. She kissed him back. The evening light lay gold across the porch, and the meadowlark sang in the pasture, and somewhere far off across the plain, A coyote called and received no answer, and she was kissing a man she had despised, or told herself she had despised, and it felt like the most natural thing that had happened to her in years. When he pulled back, he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, unguarded and a little undone, and she imagined she looked much the same. "I should have come to your door the first time I rode past this land," he said. She put her hands on his chest. "You came when you came," she said. "It was enough." The gossip in Caldwell was immediate and enthusiastic. Sadie had known it would be and had prepared herself for it. But there was a difference between knowing something would happen and experiencing the particular texture of it, the glances in the general store, the conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the opinions delivered to her directly by women who believed they were being helpful. Mrs. Harriet Dobbs, who was the wife of the town's physician and who had always been moderately kind to Sadie during Thomas's illness and after, stopped her on the boardwalk one morning in early September and said, with the particular mixture of genuine concern and reflexive judgment that characterized her, that she hoped Sadie knew what she was getting into with a man like Luke Collier. Sadie had looked at Harriet Dobbs for a moment and then said, "Yes," and kept walking. She was not interested in explaining herself, and she was not interested in the opinions of people who had not shown up for her in June when she had an hour to save her land. Luke Collier had shown up. She had given that considerable weight. Douglas Crane, for his part, watched Luke Collier's increased presence in the community with an expression that Sadie could only describe as dissatisfied, and this pleased her more than it probably should have. Crane had acquired 3 other properties in the county over the previous 2 years from people who could not meet their notes, and she had a strong suspicion that her land had been the next one on his list, and that he was not pleased about the interruption of that plan. Sheriff Cal Drury had mentioned to her once, obliquely, that Crane had business interests in properties adjacent to her land, and the implication was clear enough. The fact that Crane was unhappy about the situation was not something she could directly act on, but it settled something in her that she had not fully admitted was unsettled. The threat to her land had not been simply a matter of an unfortunate debt. It had been something more deliberate than that. She mentioned this to Luke one evening in September, and he listened without interruption, which he was good at, and when she was done he was quiet for a moment. "I know about Crane," he said. She looked at him. "What do you know?" "I know he's acquired 4 properties in this county in the last 3 years, Luke said. 2 of them from widows who owed notes to his bank. One from a farmer whose note he called in early, which was legal but the timing was suspicious. One from a family who will tell you to this day that the original document they signed was not the document that was enforced." He paused. "I came to Caldwell 2 years ago because I heard about Crane and I thought there might be something to be done about it." She stared at him. "You came here because of Douglas Crane?" "Partly," he said. "I had other reasons too. But I'd been hearing about Crane for a while, and I have some history with men who operate the way he operates." He looked at his hands. Decker, in Texas, ran his operation with the same logic. Take what belongs to other people by finding the legal mechanism that lets you do it and calling it business. "Have you done anything about Crane?" she asked. "I've been collecting information," he said. "I've been talking to the families he took from, writing things down. I have a friend who is a lawyer in Wichita who has been looking at whether there's a case." She absorbed this. The man who had ridden with rustlers in Texas in 1877 had spent the better part of 2 years building a case against a predatory banker. She was not sure what to do with this information, but she found that it settled into something she was coming to recognize as the shape of who he actually was, which was more complicated and more decent than he appeared and more troubled by his past than he talked about. "What will you do with the information?" she asked. "Give it to the lawyer," he said. "Let him do something with it that's legitimate. I'm done doing things the other way." She looked at him for a long moment. "Luke," she said. "Sadie. The next time you decide to take on something that concerns me and my land and my life," she said, "I would like to be part of that decision." He held her gaze. "You're right," he said. Yes, she nodded. And then, because she was the kind of person who said what she meant when she had decided to mean it, I'm very glad you showed up in June. So am I, he said, and the roughness in his voice was not the roughness of a man performing emotion, but the roughness of a man who actually felt something and did not quite know how to contain it. He asked her to marry him in October, on a Sunday morning when the autumn had finally broken the summer's grip, and the air smelled of dry leaves, and approaching cold, and the prairie grass had gone gold all the way to the horizon. He had not planned an elaborate proposal. He was not the kind of man who planned elaborate proposals, and she was not the kind of woman who needed one. He had come on Sunday morning for breakfast, as he had been doing for the past 3 weeks, and they had eaten and cleared the table and were standing in the kitchen with the October light coming through the window, and he simply said it. "Sadie," he said, "I'd like to marry you." She looked at him across the kitchen. She had been thinking about this moment, or the possibility of this moment, for several weeks, the way you think about something you know is coming, and are trying to understand how you feel about it before it arrives. She had felt guilty about it, initially, because feeling anything at all seemed to be against some rule she had set for herself in September of last year when Thomas had died, and the rule had felt necessary then, like a plank you grip when you are in water and are not sure yet whether you can swim. She had come to understand that she could swim. The land was hers and she had held it, and she had pulled herself through 11 hard months, and the rule was not a plank anymore. It was just a rule, and she was choosing now whether to keep it. She looked at Luke Collier in her kitchen in the October light and thought about who he was, not who she had first thought he was, but who she had come to know in 4 months of Saturdays and Wednesdays and stormlit evenings, and honest conversations and hands touching across a table. She thought about his quiet and his directness, and the scar on his jaw and his handwriting that had surprised her, and the way he said grace, and the way he listened to her talk about the land, as if it mattered to him because it mattered to her. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and she met him halfway, and he held her with both arms around her and his face against her hair, and she could feel the long exhale of him, all that contained feeling releasing at once, and she put her arms around him too and held on. "I have to tell you something," he said into her hair. "Tell me," she said. "I don't know how to be a husband," he said. "I know how to be a lot of things, none of them entirely settled. I don't know how to stay somewhere permanent. I never have." She pulled back enough to look at him. "Can you learn?" she said. He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes. "I want to," he said. "That's what I know for certain. I want to." "Then that's where we start," she said. They were married in November of 1882 in the small Methodist church on the south end of Caldwell's Main Street, with the minister presiding and perhaps 30 people attending. It was not a large wedding. Sadie had not wanted large. She had wanted the people who had actually mattered in the difficult year, which was a shorter list than politeness would normally suggest. Sheriff Cal Drury came, which she appreciated. The owner of the feed store, a man named Joseph Plum, who had extended her credit twice during the difficult months without being asked, and without making it into a performance, came with his wife. A woman named Clara Reeves, who had lived 3 miles north and who had brought Sadie a pot of soup every other week for the entire autumn after Thomas died, and had never once said anything that required a response, came alone, her husband being in poor health. Several people came who had not been particularly present during Sadie's difficulties, but who wanted the social occasion, and she accepted their presence with a grace that cost her nothing, because she was too happy to spend energy being precise about who deserved to be there. Luke had no family to invite. He wrote a letter to a man in Texas who had been a friend of his brother's, and the man wrote back to say he was glad Luke had found something worth staying for. Luke read this letter twice and folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, and Sadie saw him do this but did not mention it. The ceremony was short and straightforward. She said her words and he said his words, and the minister told them they were married, and Luke kissed her in the Methodist church in front of 30 people, and the Caldwell afternoon in God, and she was not embarrassed about any part of it. They left the church and rode home together to the farm, the 400 acres of good grazing land with the 2-room farmhouse and the stone chimney and the clean running well. And it was different riding home with him beside her than it had been riding home from town in June with him 20 feet behind her on the road. The land looked the same. She felt entirely different inside it. That winter they worked the farm together, and she learned the ways in which sharing work was both easier and more complicated than doing it alone. Easier because the physical labor was genuinely divided, and there was someone to hold the other end of whatever needed holding. More complicated because two people who have both spent years being entirely self-sufficient have habits of doing things their own particular way, and discovering that another person does it differently requires a constant low-level negotiation. They were both stubborn. She had known she was stubborn for years. She discovered that he was stubborn in ways that were different from her stubbornness, which meant that their arguments were occasionally impressive in their completeness, but rarely lasted past the evening, because they were both also, at the core, practical people who knew that an unresolved argument in a 2-room farmhouse was inefficient. He was learning to stay, she could see it. It was not a struggle exactly, but it was an effort, the effort of a man who had spent over a decade moving and who was now choosing not to, building the habit of permanence the way you build any habit, with repetition and intention and some grace when the repetition failed. She gave him the grace when it was needed, and he gave her room when she needed it, and they figured it out between them in the way that people figure things out when they are both genuinely committed to the figuring. The lawyer in Wichita, whose name was Andrew Pell, made progress on the case against Douglas Crane in the early months of 1883. Luke had continued corresponding with him through the winter, adding to the collected accounts of the families Crane had taken from, and in March Andrew Pell came to Caldwell himself and spent 3 days taking formal statements. The statements documented a pattern that was, if not provably criminal in every particular, deeply injurious to the community and potentially actionable in several specifics, including the family whose signed document had, Pell believed, been altered after the fact. The case moved through the proper channels with the slowness that proper channels required, but in September of 1883, Douglas Crane settled a civil suit brought by the family of the altered document, making a payment that was described in the Caldwell newspaper as a voluntary resolution of the parties' dispute, which was the newspaper's genteel way of noting that Crane had paid to make the problem go away before it became something worse. Shortly afterward, Crane sold 2 of the properties he had acquired, at prices that suggested he wanted to reduce his holdings in the county rather than invite further scrutiny. He did not sell his bank. He remained in Caldwell and remained a powerful man, and Sadie had no illusion that he had become a different person or that justice had been done in any complete sense. But the pattern had been interrupted, and the families who had given statements had the satisfaction of having been heard, and the land that Douglas Crane no longer held had gone back into hands that could do something honest with it. She told Luke one evening in October of 1883, sitting on the porch with the autumn dark coming in and the stars beginning to show over the plain, that she thought what he had done about Crane was the best possible version of what he could have done. He looked at her. "How do you mean?" "You could have done it the other way," she said. "The way you used to do things, it would have been faster." "It would have been wrong," he said. "I know," she said, "but you knew that. You knew it before I said anything, and you did the right thing because you knew it, not because anyone told you to." She paused. "I wanted you to know I noticed that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I had a reason to do things right by this point," he said. "A person I was accounting to." She looked at him. The stars were very bright over the plain, the way they got in October when the air was clear and cold, and there was nothing between you and the sky for 50 miles in every direction. Me, she said. You, he said simply, and she felt the word land in her chest like something that had been waiting to be said and was glad to have arrived. She was expecting their first child by November of 1883. She had known for several weeks before she told him, not from uncertainty about telling him, but from the desire to be completely sure first, to let the knowledge settle in her own body and mind before she brought it into the space between them. When she was sure, she told him on a Sunday morning over breakfast, in the same kitchen where he had asked her to marry him. He went very still when she said it. She watched his face as the information moved through him, the stillness and then something rising up through it. And then he got up from the table and came around it and crouched down beside her chair and took her hands in both of his. And she looked at his face and saw something there that she recognized as the expression of a man confronting the reality of something he has wanted more than he knew how to want. A baby, he said. In June, she said. He pressed his forehead against their joined hands briefly, and she felt rather than heard whatever sound he made. Luke, she said softly. He raised his head. His eyes were bright. I'm all right, he said. More than all right, he paused. Are you well? Are you feeling well? Very well, she said. Strong. Of course you are, he said, and the warmth in his voice made her want to fold herself into it. He was devoted through the winter in a way that she had to frequently redirect, because the devotion occasionally tipped into being overprotective of a woman who had been running 400 acres largely alone for the better part of a year, and who was entirely capable of deciding for herself what she was and was not able to do. They navigated this with the combination of directness and humor that had become their primary language for the ongoing negotiation of their lives together. Her telling him when he was hovering and him learning slowly to trust her self-knowledge. He did take over every task that involved any real physical strain without being asked and without comment, which she allowed, because the allowance cost her nothing and clearly meant something to him that was about more than the present practical matter. The baby arrived in June of 1884 in the farmhouse bedroom, with the help of the doctor's wife, Harriet Dobbs, who had come immediately when sent for, and who worked with a competence that made Sadie revise her earlier mild irritation into something warmer. Luke was in the house, not far, and she could hear him pacing in the kitchen at the points when the labor was loudest. The baby was a boy. Luke came in when the doctor's wife opened the door, and held his son for the first time with the particular care of a man who has never held a newborn, and is suddenly confronted with the specific fragility of a new human being. He held the baby like someone holding something irreplaceable which was accurate, and he looked at the small face with an expression that Sadie would think about for the rest of her life. He looks like you, Luke said. He looks like a newborn, she said, because newborns all look like newborns, but she said it gently because she understood what he meant. What do you want to call him? Luke asked, not taking his eyes from the baby's face. She had been thinking about this. James, she said. James William Collier. The William was for his brother, which she had decided privately, and which she saw him understand when she said it, the understanding moving across his face quietly. James William, he said. If that's all right, she said. That's more than all right, he said. He looked up at her then from the baby to her face, and the look he gave her was so entirely unguarded and full of feeling that she had to blink several times. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me for a baby, she said. That's a shared enterprise. I'm thanking you, he said, for everything, for letting me stay, for being who you are, for this. He gestured with a slight lift of his chin to the room, and the house and the land beyond it, and all the ordinary, extraordinary fact of the life they had built. She reached out and touched his face, her palm against the jaw with the scar, and held it there. You're welcome, she said. James William Collier grew that first summer into a healthy, loud, insistently present infant who had decided from approximately the third week of life that he preferred his father's arms for sleeping, which Luke bore with an equanimity that she found profoundly charming. He would sit in the kitchen in the evening with the baby on his chest and read, or talk to her about the day's work, or simply sit quietly while the child slept, and the image of this became one of the central images of her life, the way certain images do when you recognize in the moment of seeing them that they are important. The farm prospered in 1884 and 1885. Luke's knowledge of cattle, built over years of working drives, proved genuinely useful applied to their own small herd, and they added 12 head in the spring of 1884 and sold at a fair price that autumn. He built a proper barn in the summer of 1884, a real structure, solid and square, with the help of Joseph Plum and 2 of his sons who came out for the 3-day raising and went home with a meal and Sadie's sincere gratitude. The barn was the first thing Luke had built. She understood this about it without him saying so, that a man who had never stayed anywhere long enough to build something was putting stakes in the ground in the most literal way available. She walked through it the first morning after it was completed and ran her hand along the new wood of the center beam, and understood that the barn and the farm and the land and the life were now genuinely, fully, jointly theirs. He began teaching her to do accounts his way, not because her way was wrong, but because he had learned from working cattle drives how to track complex numbers across seasons in a way that made planning easier. And she taught him to preserve vegetables and fruit properly, not because he would need to know it alone, but because knowing together was better than one person knowing and one person not. They traded knowledge back and forth across the table in the evenings, 2 people who had each been necessary to themselves and were learning to be necessary to each other, and it was the most satisfying kind of learning. Clara Reeves, the neighbor who had brought the soup during the hard autumn of Sadie's widowhood, became a real friend in these years. She came by several times a week, and her husband, whose health had been precarious for a long time, died in the winter of 1884, leaving her alone on her property 6 miles north. Sadie rode up to see her the week it happened and came back and told Luke that Clara was going to need practical help through the winter, and he said of course, and that was all the conversation required. They helped Clara through that winter and the next, and Clara became a fixture in their lives, a woman of 50 with weathered hands and sharp opinions, and a warm affection for James that the baby reciprocated with the totality that infants bring to attachments. She told Sadie once, in the second winter, that watching Luke Collier with a child was the most persuasive argument she had ever seen against whatever his reputation had once been, and Sadie had laughed and agreed. By the spring of 1885, when James was not yet a year old, the life they had built was solid enough that Sadie could see its shape in the future as well as the present. The land was secure. The herd was growing in a manageable way. The debt to Luke had been paid in full in February of 1885, which she had done in a single payment when the autumn sale of cattle put them in a position to manage it, and the paying of it had felt like the last formal boundary between the crisis of June 1882 and the life they were living now. She had put the receipt for the repayment on the table and slid it across to him, and he had looked at it, and then at her. "That was a small fortune to appear at my door on a June morning," she said. "Cattle drive wages add up," he said. "Luke," she said, he met her eyes. "You could have kept riding," she said. "That morning, you didn't have to stop." "No," he said, "I didn't." "Why did you stop?" He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was choosing to be precise rather than easy. "I'd been watching the land for months," he said, "and I'd been watching you, and I knew what Crane was doing, the pattern of it, and I thought if I had a way to interrupt it I should." He paused, "and I wanted to be the one who showed up." She looked at him across the table. "Because of me." "Because of you," he said, "and because of the land. And because I was tired of being someone who kept moving past things without stopping." He looked at the receipt and then back at her. "I wanted to stop." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm very glad you stopped," she said. "You've mentioned that," he said, with the quiet edge of humor she had come to love. "I'll keep mentioning it," she said, "regularly, forever. You're going to be very tired of hearing it." "I'm not," he said, and meant it. In the summer of 1885, they celebrated James's first birthday with a small gathering at the farm. Clara and Joseph Plum's family and the Drurys. Cal Drury having become something closer to a friend in the years since June of 1882, partly because Luke's demonstrated commitment to legitimate life had resolved whatever wariness Cal had carried about him, and partly because the men simply turned out to get along. James sat in the middle of the porch and looked at the people around him with the expression of great satisfaction that healthy one-year-olds carry, certain that the gathering had been arranged for his specific benefit, which was nearly true. That autumn, Sadie discovered she was expecting again, and this time she told Luke the same evening she was sure, because waiting seemed less necessary now. He received this news with the same quality of stillness followed by feeling as the first time, though with perhaps more ease, the case of a man who knew now what these first suspended moments before something enormous became real actually contained. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Sadie," he said, "I'm the happiest I have ever been. I'm the happiest I knew it was possible to be, and I didn't know it was possible until you. So yes," he smiled at her, "I'm happy." The second child arrived in June of 1886, a girl this time, small and emphatic and possessed from the first hours of a personality that left no one in any doubt about her preferences. They named her Margaret Ruth, after Sadie's mother who had died when Sadie was 12. Margaret was, from the beginning, a different creature than her brother. Where James was watchful and measured and took things in before reacting, Margaret was immediate and vocal and decided. And the house rearranged itself around her presence the way houses rearrange around forces of nature. Luke held his daughter on the evening of her second day and looked at her with an expression that was recognizably the same as the one he had given James, and yet entirely different, calibrated to this specific small person. And Sadie, watching this, felt the deep satisfaction of witnessing something that was exactly right. "She's going to be difficult," Luke said. "She's going to be wonderful," Sadie said, "which is the same thing sometimes." "She takes after you," he said. "She's 2 days old." "I can already tell," he said, and kissed the baby's forehead. The years moved in the way that good years move, neither slowly nor quickly, but with a fullness that made time feel significant without feeling heavy. James grew from an infant into a small boy with his father's dark eyes, and his mother's particular habit of thinking before speaking, which Luke observed with pride and Sadie observed with amusement, because she could see the combination clearly, and it was very much its own person already. Margaret grew from an emphatic infant into an emphatic small girl, who had decided by age 2 that she was primarily interested in being outdoors, which resulted in her appearing at regular intervals covered in some natural substance and entirely satisfied with herself. Luke took both children out on horseback beginning when each of them could sit up steadily, James at 18 months and Margaret at 14 months, impatient to be included, and Sadie would watch from the porch sometimes as Luke walked the horse slowly around the near pasture with a small child before him in the saddle, and she would feel something in her chest that was so large she could not quite name it. In the spring of 1887, when James was nearly 3 and Margaret was coming up on 1, they talked about the future of the land. Luke had been approached by 2 neighboring families about the possibility of combining their herds for the drive that autumn, a practical arrangement that would reduce costs and increase the size of the delivery, which would help with the price. He brought the proposal to Sadie and laid it out, and they discussed it over 2 evenings, examining the terms and the practicalities and the relationships with the families involved. And at the end of the second evening, they decided to agree to the arrangement. And she noted, not for the first time, how different and better the making of decisions was when there were 2 people making them who each brought their full intelligence to the table without either of them trying to manage the other. That was the year they added another room to the house. Luke did most of the building himself, with help from Joseph Plum's oldest son, who was 17 and learning carpentry with his father. The new room extended off the back of the farmhouse, giving them a proper bedroom separate from the main room, and it changed the character of the house in a way that was difficult to articulate but was felt immediately. It felt like permanence. It felt like the house had decided to stay. Sadie stood in the new room the day it was finished, when the smell of fresh-cut lumber was still strong and the light was coming in through the new window that faced east over the pasture, and Luke came in behind her and stood there with her for a moment looking at the light on the new floorboards. "This is ours," she said. "It is," he said. She turned to look at him. He had sawdust on his jacket and a small cut on his palm from the saw work, and his hair needed cutting, and he was looking at her with that direct, dark gaze that she had once found unsettling, and now found to be the most settling thing she knew. "Luke Collier," she said. "Sadie Collier," he said. She had not fully gotten used to her name being his, even after nearly 5 years, because she had been Sadie Walker for long enough that the change still occasionally surprised her. But when he said it, there was nothing about it that felt like loss. It felt like addition. "I want you to know something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I know what you gave up to stay here," she said. "The moving. The freedom of not being accountable to a place or a person. I know that was something you'd had for a long time and that staying cost you something, at least in the beginning." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know," she said, "that I see what you chose every day. I see you choosing this." She gestured to the room and the house and the land beyond it. "And I want you to know that I choose it too, every day, not because I have no choice, but because it's what I want. You and this land and our children and this life. It's exactly what I want." He crossed the room and put his arms around her and held her for a long moment without speaking, his chin against the top of her head and his heartbeat steady under her ear. "I used to think," he said quietly, "that the moving was freedom. That staying was the thing you gave up freedom for." He paused. "I was wrong. This is free, choosing something real and staying with it and building something that lasts." He pulled back enough to look at her. "You showed me that, not on purpose, just by being who you are." She put her hands on his chest. "We showed each other," she said. "That's how it works." He kissed her in the new room with the smell of lumber and the morning light coming in from the east, and the children were in the main room and could be heard in the particular way that small children make themselves audible even when they are being relatively quiet, and the cattle were in the south pasture, and the well was running clean, and the autumn was coming with its good clear air and its promise of harvest. The following years continued to build on what they had made. The combined cattle drive of 1887 was successful and led to a longer-term arrangement with the neighboring families, which gave their operation more stability than the fluctuating cattle market of the decade would otherwise have allowed. They sold timber rights on a small stand of trees on the north edge of the property for a reasonable sum in 1888, money that went toward improving the water supply and repairing the barn roof, and acquiring 3 more head of breeding stock. James started school in 1888 when he was 4, riding with his father into Caldwell on the school days and riding back in the afternoon. He was a serious student from the beginning, with a particular interest in numbers, and his teacher sent a note home in the spring of 1889 saying that he was ahead of children 2 years older in his arithmetic, and that they should consider what this might mean for his future. Sadie and Luke sat with this note and talked about it, about what a boy with that kind of mind might want, and what education might be available to him as he grew. And it was a conversation that opened into a larger one about what they hoped for their children, and what they were building the farm for, and what kind of future they were trying to create. Margaret, at 3, was less interested in sitting still for school than she was in being outside, a preference that showed no sign of changing. She followed her father around the farm with the dogged intensity of a small person who is determined to understand everything, asking questions that were sometimes remarkably penetrating and sometimes entirely unanswerable by any existing human knowledge. Luke answered the answerable ones carefully and the unanswerable ones with equal care, which Sadie felt was the right approach. A girl who asks questions should be told when there are answers and when there are not, and the difference should be made clear. It was Margaret in the autumn of 1889 who asked the question that caught them both entirely unprepared. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her mother while Sadie was doing accounts, and she looked up from the drawing she was making and said, with the directness of a 3-year-old who has not yet learned to approach topics obliquely, "Mama, was Papa always our Papa?" Sadie looked at her. She and Luke had talked, in the broad way of parents who know a conversation will be necessary at some point, without knowing exactly when, about how to explain the fact of Thomas to the children, particularly James, who bore his mother's previous name and who might one day ask about it. Margaret had arrived at the question first, and she had arrived at it in her own way, which was directly and without preamble. "Your papa married me 3 years before you were born," Sadie said carefully. "Before that, I was married to a man named Thomas Walker, who was a good man, and he died before you were born." Margaret considered this with the seriousness she brought to complex information. "Did you love him?" she asked. "Yes," Sadie said. "Do you love Papa?" "Very much," Sadie said. "Good," Margaret said, and returned to her drawing with the satisfied conclusiveness of someone for whom the important points have been established. Sadie told Luke about this conversation that evening when the children were asleep, and he listened and then was quiet for a moment. "She's all right with it?" he asked. "She moved on in about 4 seconds," Sadie said. "She's 3. What concerned her was the love. Once that was established, she was done." "She's right," he said. "That's the important part." "James will ask eventually," Sadie said. "When he does, I want to be honest with him." "Of course," Luke said. "We will be." James did ask at age 6, with the more complex set of questions that a 6-year-old with a strong mathematical mind applies to family matters. He asked about Thomas Walker and about his name and about whether that made Luke not his father. Sadie and Luke sat with him together and told him about Thomas honestly and simply, and Luke said to his son, in the quiet, direct way he had, that names were one thing and that being a father was another thing, the thing that was built every day, and that he was James's father in the way that mattered most. James thought about this for a long time in his characteristic way, and then asked if he could see a picture of Thomas Walker if there was one. There was one, a small photograph taken in Caldwell 2 years before Thomas died. Sadie got it out, and James looked at it with the studying attention he gave to things that interested him. "He looks kind," James said. "He was kind," Sadie said. "Okay," James said, and handed the photograph back and got up and went back to the book he had been reading before the conversation, which was, Sadie thought, about as complete a resolution as a 6-year-old could provide. In 1890, Sadie discovered she was expecting a 3rd child, and this time the news came with a particular kind of joy that was different from the first 2, not lesser, but more settled, the joy of abundance rather than the joy of discovery. She was 36 years old and Luke was 37, and they were people who understood their life clearly now, and the new life coming was received with full and informed happiness. The 3rd child arrived in the spring of 1891, a boy they named Thomas Luke Collier, the Thomas for Sadie's first husband, because she had decided that her history was not something to obscure, and that a boy named Thomas could carry the name with respect, and the Luke because the child deserved to carry his father's name. Luke looked at her when she told him the name she wanted, and said nothing for a moment, and then said that it was a very good name. Thomas Luke was, from the beginning, different from both of his older siblings, sunny and social and apparently incapable of being upset by anything for very long. He was a round, cheerful baby who slept easily and ate eagerly, and looked at the world with a benevolent interest that suggested he had decided in advance to like it. Margaret, at 5, regarded him with the protective affection of an older sister who has decided that a baby is her specific project, and James, at 7, regarded him with the more measured approval of an older brother who can see that this is a good baby without being unduly emotional about it. Luke held Thomas Luke on the evening of his birth with the ease of a man who had held babies before, and who was, by this point, entirely comfortable in the role that had once been entirely unknown to him. He looked at the baby, and then at Sadie in the way he had always looked at her after their children were born, the deep and overflowing look that she had never been able to find words for but that she recognized as the truest version of what was between them. "3," he said. "3," she agreed. "Are you done?" he asked. She laughed. "Ask me in a year," she said. "Fair," he said. The answer, as it turned out, was yes. 3 was the family they were, and this knowledge settled over the following months with the contentment of something complete. They were a family on 400 acres of good Kansas grazing land, with a solid house and a good barn, and a clean-running well, and a herd that was modest but healthy and growing in a manageable way, and 3 children who were loud and alive, and learning their world with the particular intensity of children who have been given good roots, and are starting to discover what they can reach. The cattle drive arrangement with the neighboring families became a fixed feature of their autumn, and the combined operation gave them enough scale to negotiate better prices and eventually to consider a small investment in additional land when a 20-acre parcel adjacent to their north fence became available in 1892. They bought it together and argued productively about what to use it for, and settled on expanding the hay production that would reduce what they needed to buy through the winters. Luke's friendship with Sheriff Cal Drury deepened into something genuine over the years, and Cal Drury proved to be the kind of friend who was useful in the pragmatic, unsentimental way of men who have both been through enough to value straightforward loyalty over demonstrations of affection. He came to the farm for supper regularly enough that the children considered him a fixture, and James in particular was interested in the sheriff's stories, filing them away with the seriousness of a boy who was building a picture of the world and its people. Douglas Crane remained in Caldwell and continued to operate his bank, but his property acquisition activity in the county had stopped entirely after the settlement of 1883, and he had taken on a more reduced public profile. He died in 1893 of a heart attack that, the newspaper reported, had been preceded by months of declining health. Sadie read the notice in the paper and thought about it for a moment, and then set the paper down and went back to what she had been doing, which was working out the quarterly accounts. She was not glad that he was dead. She was glad that the chapter of her life that had included him was as completely closed as a chapter could be. Andrew Pell, the Wichita lawyer, wrote to Luke when Crane died, a short note noting the fact and expressing the belief that the work they had done in 1882 and 1883 had in some meaningful way contributed to the interruption of what could have been a much larger series of injuries to the families of the county. Luke read the letter at the kitchen table and gave it to Sadie to read, and she read it and handed it back. "He's right," she said. "Maybe," Luke said. "He is," she said. "What you did mattered. What you started before you even came to my door that morning mattered. I want you to let yourself know that." He looked at her across the table. "I know it," he said, "because you say it." "You should know it because it's true," she said. "Not because I say it." "Both can be true," he said. She conceded this. In the years that followed, as the children grew and the land continued to be held and worked and improved, and as Caldwell changed around them in the way that cattle towns changed as the trail drives became less dominant and the town shifted toward other economies, their life had the quality of something that had been worth the difficulty of its beginning. It had cost her, the first year and the crisis of June 1882, and it had cost him, the choice to stop and the choice to stay and the longer work of becoming someone who could build something. Those costs had been real, and she never pretended they weren't. But what they had built on the other side of those costs was equally real, equally true, and considerably larger than either of them could have imagined alone. On the morning of their 10th anniversary, November of 1892, Luke was up before her and had made coffee by the time she came into the kitchen, which was unusual enough that she looked at him with mild curiosity. The children were still asleep, Thomas Luke having finally outgrown the stage of waking before the sun, and the house was quiet in the gray early light. 10 years, she said, taking the coffee he held out to her. 10 years, he said. She looked at him in the gray light. He was 39 and she was 38, and the years were in their faces in the way that outdoor years put themselves there. The lines and the weathering that were not aging so much as the record of a life lived outdoors and fully. He was still the man she had watched come down the road in June of 1882, and he was entirely different from that man, which was not a contradiction. "I despised you, you know," she said. He smiled. "I know." "Not really," she admitted. "I told myself I did. It was simpler than the truth." "What was the truth?" he asked, though he probably knew. "That you made me feel something I wasn't prepared to feel," she said. "And I didn't trust you and I didn't trust it, so despising was easier." "That's reasonable," he said. "You've never told me when you knew," she said. "When you knew you wanted to stop." He thought about this, holding his coffee in both hands, looking at the window and the pale gray light of the November morning. "I watched you work," he said. "Before that morning in June. I'd been watching the land and I'd been watching you work it, and I saw a woman who was not going to be beaten by anything the land or the circumstances could throw at her, and I thought," he paused, "I thought that I wanted to know a person like that. I wanted to be near that. And then the opportunity came to do something that might matter to you, and I took it." She looked at him. "I wasn't calculating," he said. "I want you to know that. I wasn't thinking if I do this she'll have to let me in. I was thinking this is wrong and I can fix it and she should not lose this land." "I know," she said. "I've known that for a long time." "When did you know it?" she considered. "When you sat across from me and drank the coffee I made," she said. "That first supper. You didn't try to do anything. You just sat there and were who you are. And who you are is quite something, Luke Collier." He set his coffee down and came to her and put his arms around her from behind as she stood at the counter, and she put her hands over his where they crossed in front of her and leaned back against him. The gray morning light was coming through the window. Somewhere in the barn one of the horses moved. A meadowlark, impossibly persistent for November, called from the direction of the fence. "I love you," he said, into her hair. "I love you," she said. They stood there in the kitchen of the house they had built together, on the land she had held, and that was now also his, while the November morning came in pale and clear over the Kansas plain. The children would wake soon, and the day would fill with everything a day on a working farm filled with: the animals and the work and the noise, and the ordinary beauty of a life that was large enough to contain all of it. But for this moment, it was just the two of them in the kitchen, and the coffee, and the 10 years and all the years coming after them, and everything they had made of the morning one June day when the document on the table had given her 1 hour and the only man who showed up had been exactly the right one. She reached up and put her palm against his cheek, the one with the scar, the way she had done since the beginning. He turned his face slightly and kissed her palm. Outside on the fence the meadowlark sang. The land was hers, the life was theirs, and every day of it had been worth every hard thing that came before it.